Hello, this is укрлайф TV, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And our guest today is Ambassador William Taylor. He is the Vice President for Europe and Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 till 2009. Ambassador Taylor is a graduate of West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and served as infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. Mr. Ambassador, hello, and thank you very much to be with us today.
Lyudmila, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, the Russia's big war against Ukraine has been going on more than a year. What do you think, how it is possible to have such a big war in the center of Europe? Do you think that it was inevitable, or it is the results or consequences of some mistakes?
Lyudmila, I don't think it was inevitable. I think it was a horrible mistake. And I think the Russians probably understand that it was a blunder. Probably President Putin understands it was his biggest mistake as president. It threatens his regime, Lyudmila. I think that having made the mistake, having underestimated the Ukrainians, having overestimated his own military capabilities, and having no reason, having no story that he could tell, no rationale that he could give either to the Russian people or the Russian soldiers or the rest of the world on why he invaded, why he made this decision, which turns out to be a blunder. So no, I don't think it was inevitable. I think I think if President Putin had accurately measured the costs and benefits of invading Ukraine, he would not have done it. He would not have invaded. So I don't think it was inevitable.
Mr. Ambassador, some days ago, the Friends of Ukraine network, it is a coalition of former ambassadors, leading policy and international security professionals, made a special statement to Senate committees. They called to clarity in the United States mission in Ukraine and for long-range precision strike capability. Does it mean that Americans' purpose in that war are still not clearly defined, and what are the goals of America in that war?
So, Lyudmila, I think within the government of the United States, I believe that there is a clear goal. And the clear goal, which is stated on occasion, but not in as clear a set of terms that I would like. The clear goal is to reestablish a world where the rule of law prevails. And in order to do that, Russia must be pushed out of Ukraine. Russian forces must be pushed out of Ukrainian territory. That is a very clear goal from President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people and government. That's a very clear goal, to remove the Russians from Ukraine. And I believe that that is the goal of the U.S. government as well. You know, Lyudmila, we all know that there are constraints and considerations and pros and cons of making statements that are very explicit or very belligerent or very accommodating. So there's a lot that goes into public statements from any government, your government, my government. But I do believe that the goal of the United States is for Ukraine to win, which means Ukraine to push the Russians out of Ukraine. And I remember, Lyudmila, you remember as well, I'm sure, much better than I, that Foreign Minister Kuleba and I believe President Zelensky have both said that, number one, they're going to take back all of Ukrainian territory, and they have said that some of that taking back will be done militarily. And they've said some of that taking back might be done diplomatically. And that suggests that there could be patience over time on taking it back. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that the intent of the Ukrainian people, the intent of the Ukrainian government is to take back all of their territory, to push the Russians out of all of Ukrainian territory in internationally recognized borders. From 1991 all the way up to 2014, it was very clear, still clear, that those are the recognized borders. And I believe that President Zelensky and Foreign Minister Kuleba have been very clear about taking it all back. Some of it militarily, as we're seeing right now, as we have seen. We hope to see more soon. And some of it could be diplomatically, and that may take a little bit more time. But it seems to me that that goal to reestablish an order, that the world's nations lived by from World War II up until 2014, that order is important. And it's important to fight for. And Ukraine is fighting for it. Ukraine's, of course, fighting for its own existence, its own freedom, its own identity, its own independence, its own sovereignty. Ukraine's fighting for that. But Ukraine's also fighting for that order. Because if Ukraine can push the Russians out, reestablish that order, the whole world will be better off. So, long answer to your question, Lyudmila, sorry, but I do believe that that is the goal of the United States.
Mr. Ambassador, you say that the goal of USA is to reestablish the order, but Russia and Putin wants to reestablish the order as well. And as I understand, China wants to reestablish the order as well. Do you think that time is in our side? Can Russia use this time to find allies such like Iraq or South Korea? And what is the role of China here?
This is a very good question, Lyudmila. It's a very good question, and it's a question of alliances. It's a question of values that motivate alliances. You mentioned that Russia and China want to reestablish an order, a different order, presumably than the one that we've lived under, that kept us out of another world war for 69 years, from 1945 until 2014. I believe that the Chinese view of that order could be closer to Western view, NATO's view, the United States view, European view, Ukrainian view of that order. I believe the Chinese actually do believe in the sovereignty of nations, do believe in the sanctity of territorial integrity and the sanctity of borders, internationally recognized borders. That's what the Chinese keep saying. Indeed, the Chinese, as you know,
in these peace proposals, in their peace proposals.
That's what exactly what I was going to say. Exactly right. Their proposal, their peace proposal, President Xi apparently talked to President Putin about 2 weeks ago. The first point in that is the respect for sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity. And so I believe that the Chinese actually do have some allegiance to, some support for, some commitment to sovereignty of nations and territorial integrity. And I believe that's why President Zelensky was right to say, you know, there are some interesting parts of that Chinese proposal. It's not all bad. There's a lot of bad stuff in that Chinese proposal, like ceasefire in place and these kind of things that were clearly pro-Russian. But the adherence to and the support for and the recommitment to sovereignty of nations, that's worth extracting out. And that's worth, now, I don't think the Russians are there. I don't think the Russians are interested in an order. The only order that the Russians are not interested in any order. The only rule that they want to live by is might makes right. Whoever's the stronger gets to set the rules and gets to prevail and gets to take land, territory from neighboring countries. That's not an order. And then you mentioned the other nations, whether it's Iraq or South Korea or the nations in Africa, Latin America. I have to believe that those nations and most nations would rather live in a world where they don't have to worry about their neighbors invading them. The Russian order, the Russian world that they want to establish would allow strong nations to invade weak nations or weaker or neighboring nations. That can't be appealing to the Iraqis. It shouldn't be appealing to the Iranians. It shouldn't be appealing to the South Africans. It shouldn't be appealing to the Indians. It is not an attractive order. There is no order when your neighbor can invade you and get away with it. And that's what's happening now with the Russians. And that's, again, why it's so important for Ukraine to win this war, for Ukraine to push the Russians out to reestablish this war. So to demonstrate to the Indians and the Iraqis and the South Africans and the Brazilians that you cannot get away with it. You cannot get away with invading your neighbor. That's not allowed. It's not acceptable. And we will defend this order. I think that's really the importance of winning in Ukraine.
Mr. Ambassador, and one more question about the China, because it is a very important question for Ukrainians. Do you believe that China could provide some military assistance to Russia and actually enter the war?
I don't think so. I don't think so. And so far, they have not. I can surely see why they have not. If they were to enter the war, if they were to provide weapons or ammunition, artillery ammunition to the Russians, if they were to violate the sanctions that the Western world has placed on Russia, and if the Chinese were to provide these weapons and this ammunition, they would be subject to sanctions just like the Russians. And unlike the Russians, the Chinese have a lot at stake in their trade relations, their commercial relations with Europe and with the United States. Two biggest markets for the Chinese. Those two markets would be damaged if sanctions go on. If the Chinese provide those weapons and that ammunition, that artillery ammunition to the Russians entering the war, they'll be subject to sanctions. And U.S. government has made it clear, and I believe European governments have made it clear that if the Chinese take that step, make that mistake, again, make another blunder like President Putin has made a blunder, then the Chinese will pay the price, and those sanctions will damage the Chinese economy. So I don't think the Chinese are going to take that step. So far, Lyudmila, they've not. So far as we can tell, they have not provided those weapons, and I think that will continue.
You say that Ukraine must win because of many reasons, geopolitical reasons as well. But there are different possibilities to win this war. In interview for Defense One, General Mark Milley says that Ukraine is unlikely to expel all Russian forces from its territory this year. And he said no attacks anytime soon on political decision. And the British have drones, so they can help resolve the issue. Another general, Ben Hodges, who led US Army Europe from 2014 till 2017, said the Ukrainians need to be able to strike the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters on the Crimean Peninsula. And Ukraine needs most right now long-range precision strike capability What is your position?
I agree with General Hodges. I know you have interviewed General Hodges,
Yeah.
and I disagree with General Milley. Now, General Milley, if you read carefully what he said he doesn't think that it's possible to take back all Ukrainian territory from the Russians this year. Presumably, he means militarily. First of all, he doesn't know. In fact, when pushed, I think he said, "Well, all I know is it would be very hard. It might be possible, but it'll be very difficult." And that's certainly true. We know that's true. This is a hard war. This is a brutal war. This is a terrible war. And pushing the Russians out of Ukraine would not be easy. He's right about that. That's certainly right. But I agree with General Hodges, who says that it is possible for the Ukrainians to take back sooner or later all of Ukrainian territory. I think General Hodges would agree that the Ukrainian military can push the Russians back out of Ukraine, including Donbass. General Hodges would even say that it's possible to drive the Russians out of Crimea militarily, and that's where he talks about these long-range strike weapons, which I agree with him are important, and I believe sooner or later, I hope sooner, the U.S. government will agree to provide Ukraine with these long-range strike capabilities. In the meantime, I hope that the British or somebody else that have these capabilities will provide these capabilities to Ukraine, so that this counteroffensive that we've all been anticipating can succeed. And with those long-range fires, with these new armored vehicles, the armored tanks coming mainly from the Europeans, together with these newly formed and newly trained and newly outfitted Ukrainian military units, can break through the Russian lines. And this is what General Hodges talks about. When the Ukrainians break through the Russian lines with these new weapons and these tanks and long-range fires, then the Russian military, which is fragile, which is brittle, might collapse. And if that happens, then he's right. They might withdraw themselves. The Russian military may just panic and leave the country, including in Crimea. So all to say that I believe that General Hodges is right, that Ukraine can win. I think General Milley is not right when he says that he doesn't think it's possible. I think it is possible. I think he even said it's going to be hard. We know it's going to be hard, but we also know that the Ukrainian military has done hard things. They stopped the Russians in Kiev. They pushed them out of Kharkiv, pushed them out of Kherson. They are holding at Bakhmut against all odds. The Ukrainian military and General Zaluzhny and General Sirsky and all of the heroes of Ukrainian military, backed by the heroes of the Ukrainian people and government, they can prevail. I agree with General Hodges.
Mr. Ambassador, as for now, do you think that this war will be a protracted long war or not?
I think not. I believe that this counteroffensive, this late spring or summer that we were just talking about, that I just mentioned, that General Hodges has talked about as well, I believe it could be decisive. And if it's decisive, if the Ukrainians can concentrate their new forces with new weapons and newly trained units, if the Ukrainian military can concentrate forces and break through at some place along the line, I don't know where it'll be. General Zaluzhny and General Sirsky and others, they'll figure this out. They're very good at figuring out what kind of tactics and what strategy to use and where to attack and when to attack. They're brilliant about this. They've demonstrated that brilliance. But I do believe that when they do, and when they break through, then they'll be able to use these other armored vehicles, these Bradley fighting vehicles, to move quickly to exploit that breakthrough. And I believe that can happen this summer. So that's the scenario I think can happen, which would make for a short war. You asked, Lyudmila, is there a possibility of a long war? Of course, there's a possibility. It is, you can't tell about warfare. You can't tell. It's possible that both sides will try very hard. Both sides will try to break through. Neither side will break through. Both sides will get, will deplete their militaries, and that could lead to a longer stalemate. Even in that scenario, I don't think the Ukrainians will give up. I don't think they will give up claim, and they will continue to fight. But I think the short scenario that I just described, a breakthrough this spring or summer, exploiting that breakthrough, having a devastating effect on the Russian military coherence, morale, capabilities in Ukraine, that could happen this summer, and that's the short scenario.
And short scenario and long scenario is have many variants inside of them.
Yep.
And I think it is very important to say about the options for peace. Do you think that they exist today, these options? And what are those options? And how, best case scenario and worst case scenario, if it is possible?
So we've given some thought to options for peace. We've given some thought to your question about how does this war end? War termination. How does this war end? And in principle, logically, you can say, well, there are three basic cases. One case is Ukraine wins. Ukraine pushes the Russians out of their country. The other end is Russia wins. Russia mobilizes. They've got 140 million Russians, and they mobilize, and they just are able to dragoon and impress so many Russian soldiers that they eventually win. Or the long scenario that you and I just talked about is a stalemate where neither side gives up. In that case, I don't know if that's a peace or not. I think when the Ukrainians win, that could lead to peace, at least temporarily, while the Russians try to regroup after their defeat and try to rebuild. Who knows what happens in Russia after their defeat? Maybe there's a regime change. No one knows. But in the scenario where Ukraine wins, that would bring a peace for years. And during that period of time after a Ukrainian victory, the West would have to be sure that the Ukrainians can defend themselves against another attack from the Russians, because the Russians, as I say, will not give up. As long as Putin is in the Kremlin, he will be trying to take Ukraine. He does, as you know, as he has said, we all know that Putin doesn't believe Ukraine's a real country, and so he's going to take it back if he can. And so even in the scenario that I described, where the war terminates with a Ukrainian victory, we need to be sure that Ukraine continues to build up the military capability it needs to defend itself, to deter the Russians from another attack. Now, the other thing, of course, that we need to do in this scenario where Ukraine is victorious is we need to work very hard to get Ukraine into NATO. We can come back to this, but I do believe that in this scenario where Ukraine is victorious and Ukraine pushes the Russians out of its country, establishes peace, at least for the time being, so that while the Russians are defeated, they're not able to attack again, then that would be the time for Ukraine to do two things. One, apply for NATO and continue to do the work that's necessary to join NATO. And two, to build up its capabilities, military capabilities to defend itself while it is working toward NATO membership. So that's the option for peace on the victorious side for Ukraine. On the stalemate, yeah, a lot of people have thought about what a negotiation would look like. And I don't know what a negotiation. I don't know the terms of the negotiation in that stalemate. There are a couple of models that we could take a look at. One model, of course, that people look at is North Korea, South Korea. Not an agreement, not a peace treaty, but an established line that allows the South Koreans to develop their country, to develop their economy, a very successful economy, develop their democracy. The South Koreans, even though they're divided from the North, and even though there's still hostility between the North and the South Koreans have gone about the business of becoming a successful country, a successful, independent, prosperous, democratic country. And, Ukraine could do that. That's a model. That's a model. Another model that in this kind of another model and option for peace, again, is East Germany, West Germany. After World War II, Germany was divided. West Germany went on about the business of developing its economy, joining NATO, helping to establish the European Union, becoming a very successful economy and strong democracy, even though the Soviets controlled East Germany. So there are models in that sphere as well. I still believe that the best option for peace, going back to your question, Lyudmila, is for the United States and the rest of NATO to provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to break through this spring and summer, and push the Russians out and establish peace that way. That's the best option for peace that I can see.
Do you think that this war is a personal war of Vladimir Putin? Would mean that if he will go away, all wars will stop and everything will be fine between Russia and Ukraine. Do you think is it possible, or it's much more deeper situation?
It's a very good question. No one really knows the answer to this, but what we can see is that there are two answers to that, I think. On the one hand, in response, I think, to your first question, where I responded that I thought Vladimir Putin had made a blunder, had made a real mistake in invading Ukraine, and he is responsible. There's no doubt that Vladimir Putin is responsible for making that decision to invade Ukraine, which is, by the way, on a separate topic, why he should be prosecuted. He should be held accountable for that decision to invade Ukraine. That's a war of aggression. That is the fundamental crime in international relations, in the world, in the UN. That decision to invade his neighbor, that's the responsibility of Vladimir Putin, and he should be held accountable, no matter that he's the head of state. He should be held, in particular because he's the head of state, he should be held accountable. So in the first instance, he's responsible, absolutely. But it is also true that there's a whole chain of command below Vladimir Putin, not just the military chain of command, but also the whole government of Russia, the Russian Federation, the whole government, and the Duma, and the chain of command in the military. They're all, and even the Russian people who are silent, who don't lift their voices, don't protest. The Russian people are guilty as well. They are guilty as well. And unfortunately, the history of Russia that Ukrainians know much better than Americans, and Finns know much better than Americans, and Poles know much better than Americans. East Europeans more broadly know the history of Russia much better than Americans. And we learn from you that the Russian instinct for aggression, for expansion, for oppression, goes back hundreds of years. This is not just Vladimir Putin. He's responsible for this war and should be held accountable. But the Russians have been dominating, trying to dominate, expanding their control over peoples all around their border for hundreds of years. So that's not a clear answer to your question about whether it's one or the other, because Putin is responsible, but the Russian people are responsible as well.
Mr. Ambassador, I remember that maybe 2 years ago, many American analysts say that Russia is matter for USA because they don't want Russia to be close with China. It was 2 years ago position, yeah? How it looks like now? Because it is very interesting that the communication between America and China sometimes is quite complicated. And what is the role of Russia right now in this communication and maybe in nearest future?
You're right, Lyudmila, it's very complicated. The relations between the United States and China, and the United States and Russia, we know, and then the relationship between China and Russia, it's a very complicated triangle. We've talked already today about the economic links between China and Europe and China and the United States and how important they are for the Chinese economy and for the Chinese government, for that matter. That's an important component. The relations between the Chinese and the Russians, I think, is also complicated. Yes, they both say that it's the Americans' fault, that the bad relations are because the Americans are trying to surround them or trying to bring them down. So they have that in common, the Chinese and the Russians have that same story, but there are differences. There are real differences that I think are going to be clearer over time. One difference is whether or not there's real trust between the Russians and the Chinese. We all remember how Vladimir Putin, before the invasion of 2022, before February, I think it was late January, early February of 2022, President Putin went to Beijing. He went to Beijing for the opening of the Olympics, we remember. And he had long meetings with President Xi. And they came out with long statements. One long statement, and the headline of that statement was a partnership without limits. And they didn't say anything about Ukraine, very interestingly enough. They didn't say anything about an impending invasion, which happened 3 weeks later. The question is whether President Putin told President Xi that he was about to invade. And there are some indications that he didn't tell them, that Putin didn't tell President Xi, and President Xi and the Chinese government more broadly are a little irritated, even now, that they weren't informed. When they signed up to a partnership without limits, they probably didn't know that President Putin was about to invade his neighbor. They probably didn't know that President Putin was going to tear up the respect and the principles and the treaties and the UN Charter that highlights the importance of sovereignty. Again, the Chinese care about sovereignty, apparently, and territorial integrity. And so when the Russians invaded 3 weeks after being in Beijing, talking about a partnership without limits, the Chinese a little irritated. And it happened again recently. This lack of trust happened again recently. President Xi shows up in Moscow 3 weeks ago, right? And they again come out with statements. And President Xi, one of the things President Xi says, and apparently the Russians agree to, is that there's no role for nuclear weapons in conflict. That a nuclear war can't be won, should never be fought. And they went on to say in their joint statement that nuclear weapons should not be transferred to other nations. And 2 weeks, or less than that, I think about within a week of making that statement with the Chinese, President Putin declares he's going to send nuclear weapons. He's going to put nuclear weapons in Belarus. The Chinese can't be happy about that. They cannot be. I mean, they have to be offended by that. And so I do believe there's difficulty. Now, on a broader scale, Siberia is nearly uninhabited, and China has a lot of people. There are a lot of Chinese. Siberia has a lot of natural resources. The Chinese need natural resources. You can see the tension that could provide to this relationship between the Chinese and Russians. And in particular, if the Russians lose, if the Ukrainians win, if the Ukrainians defeat the Russians will be very weak. They will be defeated. The Chinese will be emboldened to look at Russia as very weak and, maybe not be able to defend themselves. But the Chinese also just did the same thing. In that scenario where Ukraine wins and defeats the Russians, the Chinese might think twice about trying to invade Taiwan because they can see how the Russians tried to invade Ukraine and lost. And the Chinese might have the same concerns that it might happen to them. It's harder, actually, to invade Taiwan than it is to invade Ukraine for obvious reasons. So this is all to say it's a very good question, Lyudmila, and there are a lot of people with a lot of views about this relationship among the three powers that we're talking about, the U.S., Russia, and China. But I think it's wrong to think that the Chinese and Russians have a alliance or that their views align. I think there's a lack of trust. I think the economics argue in the other direction. And I think the Russians are the junior partner, and they know it.
Mr. Ambassador, very often here in Ukraine, many experts tell me that USA will not be happy if Russia will lose immediately because China will have possibility, you explain, to take some maybe territory and to take more influence under Russia. Is it true?
I don't think so. I think certainly I don't believe that. I don't worry at all about the effects on Russia of Ukrainian victory. I think Ukrainian victory is so important for all the reasons that we've talked about that we should do everything we can to make that victory happen. We should provide Ukraine with everything it needs to make that victory happen. And then whatever happens in Russia happens. Maybe it falls apart. Maybe Russia falls apart. That's one possibility. That's not something to be feared. Ukrainians know very well how the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. It wasn't a disaster. Indeed, it was a great thing that happened. Many people became free. Many former Soviets became Ukrainians and became Kazakhs and became Armenians and became Latvians. All of a sudden, there were a lot more free people in the world than there were before the Soviet Union disappeared. So if Russia disintegrates after a Ukrainian victory, we should take measures and we should diplomatically try to take the steps that are being necessary, control nuclear weapons, of course. If there are humanitarian concerns in some parts of Russia that's disintegrating, that they can't find enough to eat, we should be alert to those. But our main interest is for Ukraine to win, and then the Russians will take care of the next step. We don't know what would happen in Russia, but it's not something to be feared.
Mr. Ambassador, in one of your interviews, you say that Putin has united NATO. what does it mean? How NATO change during this year? And do you think that NATO will change next year? Because we know that the huge amount of weapons will be produced next years, maybe next decades. And do you think that next decades will be, the time of such huge weapons production like in Soviet era,
I still believe that President Putin has united Ukraine and united NATO like never before. So earlier in my career, Lyudmila, I served in Brussels as the U.S. mission to NATO in the late 80s as the Soviet Union was about to disintegrate and the Berlin Wall was about to fall in 1989. I was in Brussels. I worked at the U.S. mission to NATO. I was there in NATO. I was there for 5 years. At the time, there were only 16 nations in NATO, only 16. And the rules of NATO decision-making required unanimity. In order to decide anything, you have to have we had to have at that time, all 16 nations agree. And that was hard. That was hard to get all 16 nations to agree on anything. Now, there are 30, and about to be 31. As soon as the paperwork is signed for the Finns, there'll be 31 nations in NATO. And in the face of the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, those 30 and now 31 nations have been united like never before. They have agreed on every step of the way. They've agreed on the weapons. They've agreed on coming together to coordinate the weapons. Yes, there have been some internal discussions about when to provide the tanks and that kind of thing, and whether or not to send the F-16s or the Soviet era aircraft. Yes, those tactical debates, those are important. But the overall message is that NATO is united against the Russian invasion. NATO is united in support of Ukraine, and that is due to Putin's blunder. That's what he has done. Now, you asked a good question about the stockpiles and about the defense industrial base of NATO nations. Another thing that Russia's war against Ukraine, that Ukraine's fighting against Russia has done is highlight the need for NATO members to ramp back up their industrial capacity. Before the Russians invaded Ukraine, it was hard to imagine a big land war in Europe, like World War II. That was so long ago. Big artillery battles, big tank battles, stable lines, stalemated lines, slugfests of artillery duels back and forth. Enormous amounts of artillery ammunition being fired in both directions. It was hard to imagine that. Now it's reality. And it's clear that the United States and NATO allies need to ramp up their defense industrial base. They need to take measures to put in place long-term contracts, long-term large contracts for weapons and ammunition, because Russia has demonstrated that a big war in Europe is still possible. It's going on right now. Now, what we need to do and what we've already started doing is to ramp up our industrial base, and other nations are doing the same thing. We've seen the EU, the European Union, not just the European members of NATO, but the European Union is taking steps to ramp up its industrial base and provide long-term contracts for artillery ammunition, 2 billion euros that the European Union is going to put into this. So they are taking steps as well. And then, of course, most of the European Union members are also members of NATO. So this is going to benefit NATO and the EU and increase our security, because we do need to have an industrial base. We do need to be able to confront the Russians. We do need to be able to deter the Chinese. and we have to be prepared for that scenario as well. And what the Russian invasion of Ukraine has done is to send a signal, a strong signal to all NATO governments, indeed all Western governments, that they need to have the industrial base to be able to deter and defend against the Russians and against potentially against the Chinese.
Mr. Ambassador, last question, which is very important for Ukrainians and maybe for unity of NATO. It's a presidential company in USA, and the results of this presidential company, because everybody worried that something could change, for example, in support of Ukraine or for the unity of NATO.
So, Lyudmila, I know that worry. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I will tell you, I don't worry about that. I am confident that the United States, that the American people will continue to support Ukraine until it wins. I'm confident. And the basis of my confidence is not just wishful thinking. The basis of my confidence is that the support for Ukraine has been bipartisan. It is led by Democrats and Republicans. The support for Ukraine is there's no stronger supporter of Ukraine in the Congress than Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. We look at the House side, the House of Representatives in Washington. It's now led by the Republicans, but the chairman, the chairman of the important committees in the House of Representatives, Republicans, are strong supporters of Ukraine. I was, like many of us, we were in Munich a month ago, and I sat on a table at dinner with 5 Republican members of Congress who were there, and 2 committee chairs. Representative McCall, Chairman McCall, was there, who chairs the Foreign Relations Committee, and no stronger support. I mean, there was very strong support. That's why they were there. That's why they were in Munich, to demonstrate support for Ukraine. So I am confident that the American people, no matter who they choose in 2024, that there will be continued support for Ukraine, and that will be support for reconstruction, because in 2024, that will be after the victory. The victory comes this summer, Lyudmila. I'm still going for this short war scenario and this counteroffensive that I am looking forward to this summer to see the defeat of Russia and the victory of Ukraine. And then by 2024, when there will be an election, several elections in 2024, but in the United States, that election will be, how can we support reconstruction in Ukraine? Because that's what the debate will be in 2024, and that will be after Ukrainian victory.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you very much for having me. It's good to talk to you.
Thank you. укрлайф TV and Lyudmila Nemyria from Kyiv. Stay with us.